Welcome everyone to our live stream. This is Aini Living Conversations 169th session. I'm with Blue Heron Woman. I am Julian Gattari. Today we are into the next chapter of In the Absence of the Sacred, the Abyss of the System. We're looking at different aspects of this system of domination that we're living in and how we can, through understanding it, through the analysis of it, is that we can actually overcome it or understand how to get out of it. So this is crucial information. It's a kind of information that is really interesting, that is really, really difficult to hear, but it's really interesting too. So that's why I invite you to stick around and listen to the following information. Welcome everyone. We are now started. So what's in it today?
Well, we're going to continue on with this shock and awe therapy of erasing and remaking in our image, erasing countries and remaking them in our image. So developmentalism in the Latin cone, in the southern cone of Latin America, was huge. This is where we ended last week. It was really successful. Their corporations were nationalized. The gap between poor and rich was narrowing. They had good health care. They were seemed like a model citizen or a model country, Argentina especially. But for
you had to find a way to
the Chicago School of Economics couldn't handle that, right? So Eisenhower was the president at the time, and he proved eager to take swift and radical action to defeat developmentalism abroad. He didn't want to do any of the Chicago School shock therapies in the U.S. Because that would have gotten him impeached. I mean, right? So he was eager to do it abroad. So when he took office in 1953, Iran had a developmentalist leader as their president, or whatever they called him. His name was Mohammad Mossadegh, who had already nationalized the oil company. And Indonesia was in the hands of an increasingly ambitious guy named Ahmed Sukarno, who was talking about linking up all the nationalist governments of the third world into a superpower, which would have made him really strong against the U.S. and Britain. So of particular concern to the State Department was the growing success of these nationalist economies in the southern cone of Latin America. American and European corporations doing business in Latin America began to express complaints to their government about how the products were being blocked and their workers were demanding higher wages. And oh my God, there was growing talk that everything from foreign-owned mines to banks would be nationalized, would be taken away from the multinational corporations to finance Latin America's dream of economic independence. Oh my goodness, that possibly couldn't happen, right? So under pressure from corporate interests, a movement took hold in American and British foreign policy circles that attempted to pull developmentalist governments into the binary logic of the Cold War. The corporate interests told them, don't be fooled by the moderate democratic veneer. Third world nationalism is the first step to totalitarian communism and should be nipped in the bud. So they were turning this, trying to create panic, going, developmentalism is the first step towards communism, right? Two of the chief proponents of this theory were the Dulles brothers. One was Eisenhower's Secretary of State, and the other the head of the CIA. Before taking public posts, both of them had worked at a New York law firm where they represented many of the corporations that had the most to lose from developmentalism, like J.P. Morgan Chase and Company, the International Nickel Company, the Cuban Sugarcane Corporation, and United Fruit Company. Talk about that. So the results of the Dulles brothers' ascendancy into government were immediate. The CIA staged a coup in 1953, overthrowing the Mossadegh in Iraq and replacing him with a brutal Shah. next was 1954 when the CIA sponsored a coup in Guatemala at the behest of the United Fruit Company. Now, here's the stupid thing about corporations. I was working on my MBA at the Maharishi University in Iowa. That was started by the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who brought some of the yogic theories of India to the US in 1970. And you had to learn transcendental meditation, and they're bringing spirit. We studied United Fruit Company as though it was a wonderful company, but yet it caused, you can probably tell more about what it caused. She didn't go into what it caused in Guatemala, but it caused a coup.
Wow, didn't know that, no? Wow, this is in the 80s, right?
This was in the 54.
54, okay, because there was another coup in Guatemala in the 80s. Okay.
So the United Fruit Company is a corporation out of South Africa. Okay. And we were studying it as a good, positive company because of their sustainability policies, right? Oh, it pisses me off, the things. Anyway, so the United Fruit Company owned the corporation was indignant. The United Fruit Company was indignant with President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, who had expropriated some of its unused land from the company. But he fully compensated them. But he took it back. He took back ownership. He paid them for the, right? So they were pissed that they sold him land. That's basically, they were little kids being pissed that they sold him land, because he wanted to transform Guatemala from a backward country with a feudal economy into a modern capitalist state. So because United Fruit Corporation was pissed that he bought company money or land from them, they got the CIA to stage a coup. So they could have their land back for free that they had just been paid for. This is how corporations work. This is why. Anyway, so eradicating developmentalism in the Southern Cone was obviously going to be much bigger of a challenge than this small little coup in Guatemala. So 2 men of the Chicago School Economics Department said that the United States needed to take stock of economic programs abroad to fight Marxism. They said, we want the poor countries to work out their economic salvation by relating themselves to us and by using our way of achieving their economic development. So we want these poor countries to model themselves after the US. That's what they were saying, right? So the US government would then pay to send Chilean students to study economics at the University of Chicago. By selecting Chicago to train Chileans, a school where the professors agitated for the near complete dismantling of government with single-minded focus, the US State Department was firing a shot across the bow on its war against developmentalism, effectively telling Chileans that the US government had decided what ideas their elite students should and should not learn. This was such a blatant interference in Chile that when a Chicago school official approached the dean of the University of Chile and offered him a grant to set up an exchange program with the University of Chicago School of Economics, the dean of the University of Chile was like, yeah, fuck no. No. So the university official from Chicago went to Chile's Catholic University and offered them the deal, the dean of the Catholic University, and the dean jumped at it. So the Chile Project was born. Officially launched in 1956, the project saw 100 Chilean students pursue advanced degrees at the University of Chicago between 1957 and 1970. Their tuition and expenses were paid for by the U.S. taxpayers. In 1965, the program expanded to include students from across Latin America, with particularly heavy participation from Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. The expansion was funded through a grant from the Ford Foundation,
Mhm.
which led to the creation of the Center for Latin American Economic Studies at the University of Chicago. The students who went through this program became known as the Chicago Boys. With more funding from USAID, which was big in, right? Elon Musk he just
Mhm.
inquired into how USAID was using money. So with more funding from USAID, Chile's Chicago Boys became enthusiastic regional ambassadors for neoliberalism, traveling to Argentina and Colombia to set up more University of Chicago franchises. Juan Gabriel Valdez, Chile's foreign minister in the 1990s, describes this process as a striking example of an organized transfer of ideology from the United States to a country within its direct sphere of influence.
Hmm.
He pointed out that these ideas that were introduced into Chilean society were completely new. However, it wasn't working to bring a change to Chile because the main economic debate in the Southern Cone was not about laissez-faire capitalism versus developmentalism, but about how to take developmentalism to the next stage. Countries were like, yeah, no, we're good with our developmentalism. How do we take it? Brazil moved in the direction of developmentalism in 1962 under the presidency of João Goulart, an economic nationalist committed to land redistribution, higher salaries, and a daring plan to force foreign multinational corporations to reinvest a percentage of their profits back into the Brazilian economy, rather than spiriting their profits out of the country and redistributing them to shareholders in New York and London. Well, that just makes sense, wouldn't it? If you're doing business in a country, you need to support the country you're doing business in. No, the corporations don't have to. So in Chile, in the historic 1970 elections, the country had moved so far into developmentalism that all three major political parties were in favor of nationalizing the country's largest source of revenue, the copper mines that were being controlled by U.S. mining agents. So with those elections, they would have taken those copper mines out of U.S. hands and put them into Chilean government hands.
Copper mines in the north, yes.
And then
Mhm.
Richard Nixon was elected president of the United States. And it was Nixon who would give the Chicago Boys and their professors what they had long dreamed of, a chance at their capitalist utopia. Salvador Allende's Popular Unity government won Chile's 1970 elections on a platform promising to put into government hands large sectors of the economy that were being run by foreign corporations. Allende was a new brand of Latin American revolutionary. He was a doctor and a fierce Democrat who believed that socialist change in Chile needed to come through the ballot box, not the barrel of a gun. When Nixon heard that Allende had been elected president, he famously ordered the CIA director, Allen Dulles, to make the Chilean economy scream.
Hmm.
As soon as Allende won the vote, and before he was even inaugurated, corporate America declared war on his administration. The center of activity was the Washington-based Ad Hoc Committee on Chile, a group that included the major U.S. mining corporations with holdings in Chile, as well as the ITT company, International Telephone and Telegraph, which owned 70% of Chile's soon-to-be nationalized phone company. Purina, wow. Purina was in Chile. Bank of America and Pfizer Chemical,
Mhm.
who also had delegates on the committee. The committee's single purpose was to force Allende to back off of his nationalizations by confronting him with economic collapse.
Mm.
The companies planned to block U.S. loans to Chile and even have U.S. banks do the same. ITT went so far as to take the liberty of preparing an 18-point strategy for the Nixon administration that contained a clear call for a military coup.
Mhm.
There were two models of regime change that Allende's opponents had been studying. One was in Brazil and the other was in Indonesia. When Brazil's US-backed junta seized power in 1964, the military had a plan not merely to reverse Goulart's poor programs, but to crack Brazil wide open to foreign investment. And with that junta in place, state killings became routine. Indonesia's 1965 coup played a very different trajectory. The country had been led by President Sukarno, who enraged the rich countries by protecting Indonesia's economy, redistributing Indonesia's wealth, and throwing out the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which he accused of being facades for the interests of Western multinational corporations. Sukarno was a nationalist, not a communist. He still worked closely with the Communist Party. So the US and British governments were determined to end his rule. And he'd been in power since the World War II ended. So he'd been in power for 20 some years at that time.
Mm-hmm.
The opportunity, the CIA received high-level directions to liquidate Sukarno in Indonesia. That opportunity came in 1965 with a general backed by the CIA who had a shooting list of leftists that might resist the coup. A U.S. citizen who was involved said, "They probably killed a lot of people, and I probably have a lot of blood on my hands, but that's not bad." There's a time when you have to strike hard at a decisive moment. When do we as humans are okay that we have a lot of blood on our hands just for the purpose of money?
That's just crazy to think of.
So in Indonesia, in just over a month, at least 500,000, maybe even as many, 1 million people were killed.
Mm-hmm.
The Indonesian experience attracted close attention from the individuals and institutions plotting to overthrow Allende. Of course, of interest was not only the brutality in Indonesia, but the extraordinary role played by a group of Indonesian economists who had been educated at UC Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, right? They were known as the Berkeley Mafia. The Indonesians of the Berkeley Mafia had studied in the US as part of a program that began in 1956, funded by the Ford Corporation, Ford Foundation. So Ford was fully involved in the coups in Latin America. That's why I will never drive a Ford again. Gets worse from there. Ford sent American professors to Jakarta to establish franchises, and Ford's funded students became leaders of the campus groups that participated in overthrowing Sukarno. This economic team, the Berkeley Mafia, were not anti-state radicals like the Chicago Boys. They believed governments had a role to play in the domestic economy and making basics like rice affordable. They were, however, very hospitable to foreign investors and passed laws allowing foreigners to own 100% of the mineral and oil wealth. So within 2 years, Indonesia's natural wealth, copper, nickel, hardwood, rubber, and oil were being divided up among the largest mining corporations in the world.
Mm-hmm.
A CIA operations manager said that Indonesia was a model operation. You can trace back all major bloody events run from Washington to the way Suharto, which was the new dictator, came to power. The success of this meant that it was going to be repeated. However, Chile's coup, when it finally came, would feature 3 distinct forms of shock, a recipe that would be duplicated in neighboring countries and continue on to re-emerge in Iraq 3 decades later. The first was the shock of the coup itself, immediately followed by Milton Friedman's capitalist shock treatment, and then Ewan Cameron's shock with drug and sensory deprivation, now codified as torture techniques in the Kubark Manual and disseminated throughout training programs for Latin American police and military. So, September 11, 1973, interesting. September 11, 2001, right?
Yeah, they like to use those dates.
Yeah. September 11, 1973, General Augusto Pinochet staged his war, not a coup. Tanks rolled down the boulevards of Santiago, Chile. Pinochet had complete control of the army, navy, marines, and police. And President Allende had refused to organize his supporters into armed defense leagues, so he had no army of his own. Pinochet clearly wanted the event to be as dramatic and traumatic as possible. Chile had no experience with this kind of violence. It had enjoyed 160 years of peaceful democratic rule. So they were very easily shocked, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the years leading up to the coup or the war, U.S. trainers, many from the CIA, had whipped the Chilean military into an anti-communist frenzy, persuading them that socialists were de facto Russian spies, a force alien to Chilean society, a homegrown enemy within. In fact, it was the military that had become the true domestic enemy, ready to turn its weapons on the population it was sworn to protect. A man named Orlando Letelier had just returned from Washington to take his place as Chile's defense minister when he walked into work that morning and found machine guns pointed at him. He and other VIP prisoners were taken to Dawson Island in the southern Strait of Magellan, which was Pinochet's approximation of the Gulag. In the days that followed, roughly 13,500 civilians were arrested and imprisoned. Most ended up in the two main soccer stadiums in Santiago, where death replaced football as the public spectacle. You probably know this from your mother, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Soldiers prowled the bleachers with collaborators who pointed out the subversives, and they were taken to the skyboxes that had been transformed into torture chambers, and hundreds were executed. To make sure the terror extended beyond Santiago, Pinochet sent his most ruthless commander on a helicopter mission to the northern provinces where subversives were being held. The commander had his roving death squad single out the highest profile prisoners, as many as 26 at a time, and execute them. The trail of blood left behind in those 4 days became known as the Caravan of Death. In all, more than 3,200 people were disappeared, 80,000 were imprisoned, and 200,000 fled the country for political reasons. For the Chicago Boys, September 11 was a day of giddy anticipation because on September 12, the plan devised by the Chicago Boys, known as the BRIC, was given to all general offices of the armed forces. The BRIC held the plan of Milton Friedman's privatization, deregulation, and cuts to social spending, the free market trinity, and his economic shock programs that would make it happen. The Chicago Boys advised Pinochet that if he suddenly withdrew government involvement from all areas at once, the natural laws of economics would rediscover their equilibrium and inflation would magically go down. Well, in 1974, inflation in Chile had reached 375%, the highest rate in the world. The cost of such basics as bread went through the roof. At the same time, Chileans were losing their jobs because Pinochet's experiment with free trade was flooding the country with cheap imports. Unemployment hit record levels and hunger became rampant. So the Chicago school's first laboratory was a debacle. But they argued that the problem didn't lie with their theory, but that it was not being applied with sufficient strictness. Since their agenda was in grave danger, Milton Friedman himself showed up in Chile, and Pinochet was converted by Milton Friedman's plan, and he got to work stripping away the welfare state to arrive at their pure capitalist utopia. In 1975, they started cutting public spending again and kept cutting until by 1980 it was half of what it had been under Allende. Health and education took the hardest hits, and over 500 state-owned companies and banks now were private corporations. He removed trade barriers with a result of 177,000 industrial jobs being lost between 1973 and 1983. So by the mid-1980s, manufacturing as a percentage of economy had dropped to the levels of World War II. So Pinochet literally sent his country into deep recession. In the first year of Friedman-prescribed economic shock therapy, Chile's economy contracted by 15%, and unemployment that under Allende had been only 3% was now 20%. Why are we talking about this? Because this is happening in the US now. It's happening. It continues to happen. We have to look at all this. The most powerful criticism of this came from one of Friedman's students. He had defected from the school's free market orthodoxy. He calculated what it meant for a Chilean family to try to survive on what Pinochet called a living wage. Roughly 74% of the family's income went to buying bread without luxury items such as milk and bus fare to get to work. And we call these people criminals for coming across the border. By comparison, under Allende, bread, milk, and bus fare was only 17% of their income. This man also wrote that the Friedman prescriptions were so wrenching they could not be imposed without the twin elements that underlie them all: military force and political terror. 5 decades later, Chile is still held up by free market enthusiasts as proof that Friedmanism works. But when Pinochet died in 2006, 1 month after Friedman, the New York Times praised him for transforming a bankrupt economy into the most prosperous in Latin America. There was not propaganda there at all, was there? The Washington Post said he had introduced free market policies that produced a Chilean economic miracle. Let's look at this miracle. Pinochet held power for 17 years, and it wasn't until 10 to 12 years after his coup that the country's period of steady growth started that these newspapers were using. This steady growth is what was held up as a miracle. In 1982, despite its strict adherence to the Chicago Doctrine, Chile's economy crashed. Its debt exploded, it faced hyperinflation, and unemployment hit 30%. The cause was that the piranhas the Chicago boys had freed from all regulation had bought up the country's assets on borrowed money and run up $14 billion in debt. The situation was so unstable that Pinochet did what Allende had done. He nationalized the corporations, and almost all of the Chicago boys lost their government posts. The only thing that protected Chile from complete economic collapse in the 80s is that Pinochet had never privatized Codelco, the state-owned copper mine company nationalized by Allende. That one company generated 85% of Chile's export revenues, so when the bubble burst, the state still had funds. Chile, under Pinochet and the Chicago boys, was not a capitalist state featuring a liberated market, but a corporatist one. Corporatism originally referred to Mussolini's model of a police state run as an alliance of the 3 major power sources in society: government, business, and trade unions, all collaborating to guarantee order in the name of corporatism. What Chile pioneered under Pinochet was an evolution of corporatism, a mutually supporting alliance between a police state and large corporations, joining forces to wage an all-out war on the workers. By 1988, when the economy had stabilized and was growing, 45% of the population of Chile was under the poverty line, while the richest Chileans saw their income increase by 83%. Even in 2007, Chile remained one of the most unequal societies in the world. So if that track record qualifies Chile as a miracle for Chicago School economists, perhaps shock treatment was never really about jolting the economy into health. Perhaps it was meant to do exactly what it did: hover wealth at the top and shock everyone else into poverty. And it's precisely what they've been repeating ever since. After spending a year in Pinochet's prisons, Orlando Letelier, however you say that, Letelier, managed to escape Chile, and that's how he sought was that they intended to shock everyone into poverty. He wrote in 1976 that during the last 3 years, 73 to 76, several billion dollars were taken from the pockets of wage earners and placed in those of capitalists and landowners. Concentration of wealth is no accident, it is a rule. It is not the marginal outcome of a difficult situation, as the junta would like the world to believe, but the base of a social project. It is not an economic liability, but a temporary political success. This is what Orlando, the last name is spelled Leteliar.
I'm not good at spelling. L-E-T, like if you spell things to me, I can't like write them in my head that fast. I would need to write it on a piece of paper. I have no idea how it's spelled.
It doesn't seem like a Spanish name. It seems like a French name to me.
Yeah, it sounds like French, yes.
What he could not know at the time was that Chile under Chicago School rule was offering a glimpse of the future of the global economy, a pattern that would repeat again and again, with roughly half the population excluded from the economy altogether, out of control corruption, a huge transfer of wealth from public to private hands, with huge transfer of private debts into public hands. In Chile, if you were outside the wealth bubble, it looked like the Great Depression, but inside the wealth bubble, in its airtight cocoon, the profits flowed so free and fast that the easy wealth made possible by shock therapy style reforms have been the crack cocaine of financial markets ever since. And that is why the financial world did not respond to the obvious contradictions of the Chile experiment. Instead, it reacted with the junkie's logic. Where's the next fix? Where can we do this again? The next fix came from other countries in the Southern Cone. Brazil was already under the control of a U.S.-supported junta. Friedman traveled to Brazil in 1973 at the height of the regime's brutality and declared the economic experiment a miracle. In Uruguay, the military staged a coup in 1973 and the following year decided to go the Chicago route. The effects on Uruguay's previously egalitarian society were immediate. Wages dropped by 28% and scavengers appeared on the streets of Montevideo for the first time. Next to join the experiment was Argentina in 1976 when a U.S.-supported junta seized power from Isabel Perón. That meant Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, and Brazil, the countries that had been showcases of developmentalism, were now all run by U.S.-backed military governments and were living laboratories of the Chicago School economics. Before the junta took power, Argentina had fewer people living in poverty than France or the U.S. But we wanted them to look like us. They're just 9% in poverty, and an unemployment rate of only 4.2%. Under the junta, instantly, the country had poor neighborhoods without water and diseases running rampant. Documents show us that when the Argentina generals were preparing their coup, they didn't want the sensationalism of Chile, so they used less sensational repression tactics, but still spread terror. Rather than openly arresting or killing their prey, soldiers would just snatch them and take them to clandestine camps, torture and kill them, and then deny knowledge. According to Chile's Truth Commission, established in 1990, the secret police would dispose of some of their victims by dropping them into the ocean from helicopters after first cutting their abdomens open to help make them sink. Disappearance has turned out to be a very effective means of spreading terror. So destabilizing was the idea that the apparatus of the state could be used to make people vanish into thin air. And you know, I've had experience with this here. Coming as a single female rancher into the KKK territory, they somehow made my pigs that first year just disappear, vanish, poof, into thin air. Poof, done.
Man, didn't know that.
And then they let her go a week later. But It's,
Oh, they captured one of your pigs?
yes, they,
Oh,
yeah.
I thought they killed them. Just like,
No, they let her go a week later. She came home with babies, but I mean, and they've been doing this with my dogs too. It's just like, I understand this. It's this thing of having your something just disappear. For me, it's been animals. It's not been my loved ones that just go poof, just
wow,
poof. Right.
that's crazy.
Yeah, I can understand a little bit. By the end of the reign of Argentinian generals, an estimated 30,000 people had been disappeared. All Argentinians were in some way enlisted as witnesses to the erasure of their fellow citizens, yet most people claim they did not know what was going on. The phrase they use is, "We did not know what nobody could deny." Because everywhere you went for walks, there were dead bodies, apparently. They were just so careless about so they knew it was going on. Since those wanted by the various juntas often took refuge in neighboring countries, the regional governments collaborated with each other in an operation called Condor. Under Condor, the intelligence agencies of the Southern Cone shared information about subversives, aided by state-of-the-art computer systems provided by none other than Washington, D.C., and they gave each other's agents safe passage to carry out cross-border kidnappings. This term of subversives, I'm sorry, I'm walking to the door.
Dog needs to leave.
What's in? Diesel, Mizzy. This term of subversives, and we'll get into this in a bit. High value targets has totally shifted my my idea, my knowledge now of what happened in Iraq, and it makes it. I would imagine that all of the high value targets we saw that we treated that had been either killed or seriously injured were probably not anything more than dissidents, than subversives, people who wandered a different life than we were trying to impose on them.
Mm-hmm.
Reports from prisoners released from stadiums in Chile said that bright floodlights were kept on 24 hours a day and the order of meals was out of sequence. This was Cameron's work, to keep them unstable as to what time of day it was, right? From Chile, we hear of Villa Grimaldi prison, which was known for its Chile rooms, compartments so small that prisoners could not kneel or lie down. Prisoners in Uruguay were sent to La Isla and kept in tiny windowless cells with a light bulb on at all times. High value, here we go, high value prisoners, those that were the most opposed to the coup. This is what I'm saying. I would bet that all the high value targets in Iraq were not actually terrorists. They were actually people. Yeah.
Like, it's all political.
It's totally changed my opinion of the war in Iraq. It makes me angry. Makes me burn with a passion that says idealistic ranching enterprises has to create this revolution now, right? So this stops happening. So we say no to this misery planning and forceful imposition of misery. High value prisoners were kept in absolute isolation for more than a decade. A prisoner named Mauricio Rosenkopf said, "How do you get a Hispanic name with a Jewish name? That just..." That just floors me. So Mauricio Rosenkopf said he saw the sun for a total of 8 hours over 11.5 years. And he had to relearn colors because his senses were so deprived. After reading this and preparing this, I have to say, every single last one of American soldiers with PTSD have no reason to have PTSD. None. None whatsoever. Not a single one of them has ever faced what those prisoners in Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, and Brazil faced and still lived to tell the story.
Yeah. Like my grandma. My grandma.
Yeah, was she tortured?
Yeah, she was imprisoned.
How long?
She wouldn't talk about it a lot. She didn't like talking about it.
Well, I'm
And I really
sure.
don't know, but I know that it wasn't that long. I know that there were some that were kept prisoners for very long. She was not one of those. She was, I think it was a few months, maybe like 3 months.
It's still long enough to severely fuck someone up.
Oh, she died of Alzheimer's, saying, I just want to forget about it.
Well, I'm sure.
That's how she
I'm
died.
sure. The things they did were absolutely freaking inhumane.
Yeah. Yeah, it was crazy. And I
So,
never did. I mean, I'm learning a lot more about it from this, because from them it was just, you didn't want to go there. I mean, just
yeah.
like you don't want to be asking them tell me about it.
Yeah, no, that was, oh my God. I don't know how they survived that. We're going to talk a little bit more about what they survived.
Mhm.
So, okay, he saw the sun for 8 hours, only 8 hours over 11 years.
Man.
In one of Argentina's largest torture centers, the isolation chamber was called the Capucha,
Mhm.
the hood. A man named Juan Miranda spent 3 months there and said they keep you in a blindfold and hood with your hands and legs in chains, lying down on a foam mattress all day long in the attic of the prison. He said, I could not see the other prisoners, but they were there. I was separated from them by plywood. When the guards would bring food, they'd let me face the wall. They made me sit up and face the wall so they could pull up my hood and I could eat. It was the only time we were allowed to sit up. Otherwise, we had to lay down all the time. Other Argentine prisoners had their senses starved in cells the size of coffins called tubos. The only reprieve from isolation was the worst fate of the interrogation room. And there were dozens of variations on how electrical currents were coursing through the prisoners' bodies. Argentina's Catalonian junta was proud of its distinctive contribution. Prisoners were shocked on a metal bed called the parilla, where they were subject to the picana, the cattle prod, and the metal bed would amplify the shocks. The exact number of people. Why am I telling you all this? Because why would we tell this in our revolutionary
Mhm.
self-regulating ranching enterprise program? Because we've got to let ourselves be horrified by the shock, so by this stupidity, so we don't repeat it.
Yeah, that's it. Mhm.
The exact number of people who went through the Southern Cone's torture machinery is impossible to calculate, but it's probably somewhere from 100 to 150,000, with tens of thousands of them killed. And that's why I'm saying there's not every single soldier in the U.S. military who's after Vietnam, where those were taken POW, they have no reason to claim PTSD. None. None. They didn't endure anything like these tortured people did, these victims. None.
Mhm.
So in 1976, Orlando Letelier was in Washington, D.C. as an activist in a progressive think tank. He used his newly recovered freedom to expose Pinochet's crimes and to defend Allende's record against the CIA's propaganda machine. The activism was having an effect, and Pinochet faced condemnation for his human rights record. What frustrated Letelier was that even as the world gasped in terror at the reports of summary executions and electroshock in jails, most were silent in the face of the economic shock therapy, with the international banks showering the junta with loans, downright giddy about Pinochet's embrace of free market fundamentals. When Pinochet died in 2006, at the age of 91, he had faced multiple attempts to put him on trial for crimes committed during his rule, but he got the last word in death, having evaded all trials, and he issued a posthumous letter defending his coup and the use of maximum rigor in staving off Marxist ideology. The majority of the people swept up in the raids, tortured, and executed were not terrorists, as the rhetoric claimed, but rather the people whom the juntas had identified as posing the most serious barriers to their economic program. This is why I'm saying I have now totally rethunk what happened in Iraq while I was there, realizing that most of the high value targets were not, they were just those who were opposed. Attacks on union leaders were often carried out in close coordination with the owners of the workplaces. In the years prior to the coup in Argentina, the rise of left-wing militancy had caused 5 executives from Fiat to be assassinated. So the fortunes of the multinational corporations changed when the junta implemented Chicago school policies. Now they could flood the local market with imports, pay lower wages, lay off workers, and send their profits home out of Argentina. Several multinational corporations expressed their gratitude. On the first year under military rule in Argentina, Ford Motor Company took out a celebratory newspaper advertisement openly aligning itself with the regime, saying, "Ford Motor of Argentina and its people commit themselves to the struggle to bring about the great destiny of the fatherland." And that's what Pinochet said in his posthumous letter. He had saved the fatherland from developmentalism or Marxism, as CIA twisted it. Another Hitler. Foreign corporations did more than thank the juntas for their fine work. Some were active participants in the terror campaign. In Brazil, several multinational corporations banded together and financed their own private torture squads. In mid-1969, as the junta entered its most brutal phase in Brazil, and an extra-legal police force was launched and funded by contributions from, I'll let you guess.
Corporations.
What corporation specifically?
Ford.
Yes. Ford, General Motors, and other corporations. In Argentina, the green Ford Falcon sedan was the vehicle used for thousands of kidnappings and disappearances. So while Ford supplied the junta with cars, the junta provided Ford the service of ridding its assembly lines of trade unionists. Before the coup, Ford had been forced to give their workers 1 hour for lunch instead of just 20 minutes. And 1% of the sale of each car, just 1%, had to go to social service programs. But Ford did not like that. So all that changed abruptly on the day of the coup. The Ford factory in Buenos Aires, is that right? Pronounced right? Was turned into an ardent camp swarming with military vehicles, tanks, and helicopters. Workers have testified to the presence of a battalion of 100 soldiers permanently stationed at the Ford factory. Soldiers prowl the facility, grabbing and hooding the most active union members that were helpfully pointed out by the factory foreman. We talked about this in Decolonizing Wealth, right? Those prisoners, however, were not rushed off to a prison. They were taken to a detention facility inside the factory gates where they were beaten, kicked, and electroshocked, and then sent to an outside prison where their torture continued for weeks to months. In 2002, federal prosecutors filed a criminal complaint against Ford Argentina for those workers, and Mercedes-Benz was facing similar complaints. Because by the end of the dictatorship, virtually all the shop floor union delegates had been disappeared from the country's biggest firms, such as Mercedes-Benz, Chrysler, Fiat, and Ford. Those advocating for the workers. It wasn't only unionists who faced preemptive attacks. It was anyone who represented a vision of society built on values other than pure profit. Particularly brutal throughout the region were the attacks on farmers who had been involved in the struggle for land reform. Leaders of the Argentine agrarian leagues who were working on redistribution of land so that peasants could own land were hunted down and tortured, often in the fields in full view of their community. Meanwhile, the junta's economic policies, Chicago Boy policies, were a windfall for the landowners and cattle ranchers. In one of the shock therapies of Milton Friedman was to dysregulate prices right? So in Argentina, the price of meats had been dysregulated. So the cost in the markets for the peasants was up by 700%.
Mm-hmm.
In the slums, the targets of preemptive strikes were the community workers who organized the demands for healthcare, public housing, and education. The welfare state being dismantled by the Chicago Boys. An Argentine doctor who was detained said his torturers said, well, the poor won't have goodies to look after them anymore, as they applied electroshocks to his gums, his nipples, his genitals, his abdomen, and his ears. And he survived to tell about it.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm saying. Our U.S. military have nothing.
Mm-hmm.
This all this PTSD since Vietnam is, yeah, they have nothing. Not with this. Nothing to be PTSD about.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me almost ashamed of my countrymen, almost.
Mm.
I mean, I know they saw terrible things, but they didn't have electrodes attached to their gums and genitals and nipples. And
Yeah, well, it still would leave some PTSD, maybe not as bad, but
well, yeah, war would leave PTSD, but it's...
I mean, just listening to explosions go by, that's going to be a little bit traumatizing.
It is, but I mean, you're still intact. You didn't, that explosion was not a electroshock to your nipples or your genitals.
Right, yeah, it's not, doesn't compare.
Doesn't compare. So in Argentina, 81% of the 30,000 people who were disappeared were between the ages of 16 and 30. Among the youngest were a group of high school students who in September 1976 banded together to ask for lower bus fare so they could go to school. For the junta, this showed that they'd been infected with Marxism, and so they got tortured and killed. And now rich and poor were hurtling into different worlds, with the wealthy gaining honorary citizenship to the state of Florida and the rest being pushed back into underdevelopment. Many torturers adopted the posture of a doctor or surgeon. They imagined that their electroshocks and other torments were therapeutic and that they were administering medicine to their apestosos.
Who would believe that, huh?
To heal them of their sickness, the impulse toward collective action. And if the guards discovered the small gestures of kindness among the prisoners, those were met with harsh punishment. An estimated 500 babies were born inside Argentina's torture centers, and these infants were immediately enlisted in the plan to re-engineer society and create a new breed of model citizens. Most of the babies were sold directly to people linked to the dictatorship. A human rights group called the Grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo painstakingly tracked down dozens of these children. But, there was nothing they could do. The babies' parents were considered too diseased to be salvageable and were almost always killed in camps.
Wow. Okay.
I told you this is gut-wrenching. This is awful.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
This chapter in Argentina's history has striking parallels to the mass theft of indigenous children from their families in US, Canada, and Australia, where they were sent to residential schools, forbidden to speak their native languages, and beaten into whiteness. In Argentina in the mid-70s, clearly a similar supremacist logic was at work based on political belief, culture, and class. In 1987, a film crew was shooting in the basement of the Galerías Pacífico, one of Buenos Aires' plushest downtown malls, and to their horror, they stumbled on an abandoned torture chamber. It turned out that during the dictatorship, the First Army Corps had hidden some of its disappeared in the bowels of the mall, and the dungeon stalls there still bore the desperate markings made by its long-dead prisoners, their names, their date and dates, pleas for help. Today, the Galeria Pacifico is the crown jewel of Buenos Aires shopping district, evidence of its arrival as a globalized consumer capital. Unaffordable to the vast majority of the country's inhabitants, but a bargain for the foreigners who flock to the city to take advantage of the depressed currency of Argentina and get their Armani at bargain basement prices. For the Argentines who know their history, the mall is a chilling reminder that just as an older form of capitalist conquest was built on the mass graves of the country's indigenous peoples, the Chicago School Project was quite literally built on the secret torture camps where thousands of people were disappeared. And that's where we're going to stop tonight. Next week, we're going to talk about how the torturers got cleared of and have walked scot-free for decades.
Oh. So it gets even more gut-wrenching.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yep.
Oh, man. You would think that some sort of justice has been made.
No, and we need to do this. We need to do this because we need to understand that this has happened all over the world, and it's happening in the U.S. today under our new president.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it happens no matter.
I mean, it's been happening.
Mm-hmm.
So, and as we're going to hear this next week, it probably is the people that testify about it said it was planned misery. So that's why I've changed it from the, what we call it, from the mechanistic militant monetized model to the system that plans misery and forcefully implements it.
Yeah.
So in the absence of the sacred fire of love,
mm-hmm.
we have a system, this bloody abyss system of planned misery and forceful imposition of the misery.
Okay. So we continue this journey into next week.
Yeah.
With the change in the time, 6:45?
6:45, yeah.
6:45. And let us know any opinions, anything that you might think about this, or have you been close to someone who lived this? Let us know and join us on the next session. And know that there is a solution to this.
There is.
And that solution starts from you. You have to take that decision.
That solution is the revolution. That autolistic, resilient, self-regulating, inclusive kinship ranching enterprises is launching because we're done. We're not going to tolerate the stupidity of planned misery. Where does this come from? It comes from this idea of planned misery. Well, as I listened today, it comes from an idea that these elite are of a specific bloodline that make them different than the rest of us, which is not true. But also from anthropologists' view of the mythic hunter man who is the most cruel species that ever walked the face of this earth. So I have to ask all the men out there, are you really willing to continue labeling yourself as the most cruel, ruthless species that walks the face of this earth? Are you really? Or are you ready to say no more?
Mm-hmm.
Because the truth is, even according to Charles Darwin, it was all cooperation. It was all Aini. There was no mythic man hunter who walked the face of the earth as the cruelest species, but they've got this idea, and it shows how they can just fucking torture people, and Pinochet, no. Same with Stanley Gottlieb, the poisoner in chief of the MK Ultra. Oh no, I was doing it to save my country from the invasion of the Russians, of communism. Now we're fucking in Panama with about China because, oh my God, we're afraid of China. But we did the same thing in the Tiananmen Square. So why are we afraid of China?
Yeah, that's just excuses.
It is. It's all freaking excuses.
To be the bully. I guess the bullies must think of some type of excuse to sleep
continue
at night.
Being the most dangerous, the most cruel, ruthless man that walks the face of the earth. Yeah.
Wow. So this is the proof of the re-love. I can't say it. You can.
Revolution.
Revolution. It's difficult, huh? The proof that, I mean, here it is. Looking at this, being brave enough to look at this, to take the time to look at this. Anybody else is just swiping through consumerism. This is really stopping to love and want to fix these things and want to make it good. This is, I think, just look at all the conversations that are here. Look at all the things that we've shared, and that's plenty of proof that we have the dedication to actually want to solve this, not just profit from because I see all those people that just make news about, they're so good at pointing out the problems, and they write all the books, and they're really good at all that. But that's where it ends. They're good at analyzing and telling you about it, but are they solving anything? Are they even thinking? Are they even in the disposition to change something in their lives, to actually make justice?
No, because they're all under what I was hammering on last week. They're all under the belief that money is just energy. And this is what I'm saying. It's not.
Right.
It is not energy. It never came from Holy Mother in her yin yang dance of life. Money never.
Mm-hmm.
It's not energy. It is a tool created by man.
Yeah. So much more to say and so much more to do. And here we will be continuing here, being here for you whenever you choose to join this movement. So thank you, everyone.
Revolution.
The revolution. When you're ready to love, we'll be here to love with you. So shall we end this?
Yes.
Amazing. So see you next week, everyone.